Hello and welcome to another episode of the ICC Academy Livecast, a new podcast series where we take a deeper dive into global business trends and ideas. I'm your host Thomas Paris, and in this episode, we will learn about the history of the Incoterms rules from within the ICC itself. Our special guest today is Emmanuel Jolivet, General Counsel at the International Chamber of Commerce and author of the French publication Incoterms, Study of an International Trade Standard. Thank you so much for joining us, Emmanuel. How are you doing?
Well, I'm fine, thank you, and thank you all for joining us the ICC Academy presentation today. As you said, Thomas, we will focus on the history of the Incoterms rules, and I have to say that it's a very special year this year because everything started 100 years ago in 1919, and if you permit, I will give you a very brief introduction about the ICC, of course related to the topic of today, but it's important to understand why the ICC was set up and what was the importance of international sales and trade terms in the setting up of the organization. Everything started in 1919. In this year, a group of business leaders invited by the US Chambers of Commerce took the decision to set up an organization, a new organization, the International Chamber of Commerce, the purpose of which was, and still is, to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. So as I said, we are celebrating the centenary of the organization this year, and it's a perfect timing to study one of its many key achievements. The history of Incoterms will not only demonstrate that ICC was a visionary leader in the field of rule setting and trade facilitation, but it will also give you some tips to avoid common difficulties and sometimes mistake when negotiating, drafting, performing international contracts. I have to say that practical lessons can be learned from the history of Incoterms. So, of course, it's an historical topic that we are touching upon today, but there are many lessons, many takeaways that we could have from, and that we will have, I hope, from the few minutes we will spend together.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that context, Emmanuel. One question that I had is what trade looked like before the Incoterms rules. So in this session, we will be focusing mainly on the history of the Incoterms rules, and I think you're going to be, a fantastic resource to be able to walk us through that storied history that ICC was so much of a part of. But what prompted the demand for more modern standards, and what was the legacy of the Incoterms rules? When things got actually started?
Yes, well, I have to say that the worldwide success of the Incoterms rules is a recognition, and that's something important for the rest of our discussion today. It's a recognition that private actors, the private sector, and not only states, either directly or through international organizations, but private actors can create legal norms. And this is part of the difficulty for our topic of today. States are not the only actors, the only legislators, so to speak. So ICC has what we are used to call a rule-setting activity, as many private bodies have. But this seems now obvious. Everyone, or almost everyone, would admit it. But back in 1919, the lack of global acceptance of the concept of a legal norm elaborated by a private organization, such as ICC, had a number or created a number of difficulties, was an impediment for the development of international trade. And it also explained why the ICC and especially in the very early days, took or adopted a very cautious approach in its work on trade terms. So, elaborating, because of these difficulties, these practical difficulties for traders, elaborating international definition of trade terms was one of the primary goals of the ICC, and even one of the reasons why the ICC was set up, to the point that it was expressly mentioned during the discussion on the ICC bylaws in the Congress that led to the constitution of the organization in 1920 in Paris. Two of the founding fathers of the organization, John Fay, an American, and Etienne Clementel, who later became the first ICC chair and the first president of the International Court of Arbitration, mentioned that Incoterms, or the study not of Incoterms, but the study of trade terms at the time, was one of the key reasons why an organization such as ICC should be set up. This organization was tasked with the responsibility to study trade terms and come up with a practical solution for traders. Following this express declaration by the two founding fathers, at the London Congress of ICC in 1921, it was decided to set up a committee on trade terms. So an ICC committee on trade terms. I'm not speaking of Incoterms right now. I'm speaking of trade terms, so terminology is important. The committee was entrusted with the mission to conduct a comparative study of the meaning of those terms in various countries. So defining, expliciting, making public the meaning of a number of trade terms in various countries was the task given to this trade committee. The result of this study was the preliminary step that led ICC to believe that uniform definitions could later be elaborated for a selection of trade terms. So in a way, one could consider that trade terms are the cornerstone of Incoterms. They are really the basement of these Incoterms rules on which the first version in 1936 of the Incoterms rules and the subsequent versions of the rules were based. So in order to grasp the unique contribution of ICC to trade facilitation, let me give you a few words about the ICC, and then I will go on and try to give you an overview of the legal and practical landscape that traders were facing at the time of elaboration of the first version of the trade terms and first Incoterms. First of all, the International Chamber of Commerce is a misnomer. ICC is not a chamber of commerce. It's a membership organization registered in France as an association, that is to say, a non-for-profit legal person, but it's not a chamber of commerce. This is very important because it means that the organization has a very broad membership. It's not limited to chambers. And this has an impact on the work, and including the work on trade terms and Incoterms. So this is a grouping of members. And these members could subscribe, registered with the organization in two ways. In countries in which there is a local chapter called a national committee or a group, the ICC member will have to join that national committee or that group in order to participate in the work of the organization. And in countries where there is no such a legal structure, a local structure, the members will join the organization, will join the ICC directly. But in both situations, these members would be in a position to participate in the work of the organization. And among its numerous activities, and historically the oldest activity, the study of business practices and policy, the release of position papers, publication of materials such as definitions, guides, rules, codes related to commercial practices, banking, marketing and distribution, transport, insurance, to mention a few, has been instrumental in positioning ICC as an interlocutor second to none for traders, governments, and international organizations. I think we should keep that in mind because this is key for the future development of today. So, to respond quickly to your question, Thomas, the Incoterms rules respond to the need of international trade stakeholders for trustworthy, simple, ready-to-use, meaning off-the-shelf contractual rules. A frequent difficulty for business actors at the time was to ascertain the legal regime of international sales contracts. First of all contracts do not incorporate a choice of law clause. Well, one might regret it, but as a matter of fact, most contracts, even international ones, do not, and especially in those early days, do not incorporate a choice of law clause. But even if they do, substantive obligations imposed by a given law were unclear. And to a certain extent, it's still unclear today. So there was here a very stringent, a very difficult problem to overcome for trader. Ascertaining the state of the law was not an easy job. It was a challenge. Access to the law could also prove uneasy. One might wonder, where could the law be found? We could say in legislative documents, in acts and laws, strictly speaking, also in codes, state courts or arbitral decisions, maybe professional rules and regulation. Why not academic publications? So there was a constellation of potential sources for the law applicable to international sales and trade terms. To add to the difficulty, there was no uniform definition of an international sale. In some countries, an economic criterion to define what an international sales is was used. Well, that's the case, or it was the case in France, for example. But in other legal systems, in other countries, criteria such as nationality of the parties, the place of delivery of the goods were used. So here again, the situation was blurred and unclear. On top of that, the same business transaction could be subject to commercial laws in a country and to civil laws in another. So even the same economic transaction would not be looked at and characterized in legal terms in the same ways in different countries. And even more, within a single country, state courts did not have a uniform approach to the interpretation of sales contracts. For example, Supreme Courts were not always in a position to provide uniform interpretations. The rule of precedent as understood in common law jurisdiction, for example, is not commonly shared, especially in continental systems. So once again, I don't want to show and I try to explain as lightly as possible the situation to show a difficult situation, but this was really a problem, and you will understand, and I'm sure you did understood how difficult the situation was for business traders at the time, especially when they had no legal background or were not assisted by lawyers to understand which were the rules to which their contract was subjected. An additional difficulty, if I may go on, was that a number of disputes and differences were not and still are not submitted to state courts for adjudication. So even if one might say, well, let's look at case law to try to ascertain the law and to supplement legislative documents, materials, that's not enough. Arbitral institutions, for example, have a different case law. There are many arbitral institutions, especially many arbitral institutions linked to professional bodies, to trade associations, chambers of commerce, and these bodies may have a say through specific membership and professional rules regarding the regulation of the professions, their members. So all this to say that even the same legal relationship, the same type of sales contract was subject to a constellation of rules and created a lot of legal uncertainty for traders. Incoterms rules are therefore undisputedly a key achievement. They fulfill ICC's mission to make business work for everyone, every day, everywhere. And this explains why they have been so successful.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I think it's been very enlightening to sort of understand the ecosystem, both legally and commercially, as to why the Incoterms rules came about in the first place. You touched a little bit about the ICC as an entity, and I actually have a question about this. As you know, even back then, the drafting strategy for the rules was rather innovative. Why did the ICC decide on a legislative process for private rules?
Yes, well, the Incoterms rules are based on the evolution of commercial practices during centuries. And one should really understand that time is a key factor in the emergence, the spread, the adaptation, the disappearance of practices. Legal practices, but also logistics, are affected by the passing of time. So instead of setting a rule and trying to impose it, or to impose its use, should I say, ICC followed exactly the opposite approach. The starting point of ICC's work was the identification and the compilation of existing practices as to the use of trade terms. And I'm still not speaking about Incoterms, I'm speaking about trade terms. The frequent use of trade terms by international traders is an old and even very old phenomenon. We know that some trade terms like cost and freight and free on board, FOB, or even cost insurance freight have been used in English and maritime sales for centuries. So trade terms are not something new. They are spread over a variety of sectors and industry. And Roy Good, the former chair of the ICC Commission on Commercial Law and Practice, in charge of updating which is the ICC body in charge of updating the Incoterms rules, pointed out that in many instances, parties do not set out expressly all contractual terms governing their transactions. They will use a number of expressions, they will use a terminology, they will use terms to refer to other documents incorporated by reference into their contract. So trade terms are used to avoid specifying very long provision in the contract. They are used as a technical tool to incorporate by reference a number of other contractual provisions. And ICC never set out a single and uniform manner the criterion adopted to select the trade terms studied at the origin of the Incoterms rules. So there is no concept that was followed by the ICC, no conceptual definition. However, ICC documents, a number of ICC documents, give an indication. For example, the resolution number 13, adopted by the ICC Paris Congress in 1920, mentions that ICC wanted to study all clauses relating to international transport and sales contracts, such as FOB and CIF. During its meeting on the 14th February 1948, the subcommittee, the ICC subcommittee on the drafting of trade terms, specified that it would study the most commonly used trade terms, such as CIF and FOB. And the same year, at its meeting on the 12th of May, the same subcommittee referred to the principal trade terms. To go on, and I will stop there, on 14th of March 1949, the Committee on Trade Terms mentioned the common commercial abbreviations in international contracts. So, as I said, instead of conceptually defining what kind of trade terms it will study, ICC enumerates the terms considered. And the approach is descriptive and empirical, should I say, rather than deeply conceptualized. An additional element is given by a former ICC staff member and former secretary of the Committee on Trade Terms, Frederick Eisenman. For him, the Incoterms rules are based on the most common usages in certain kind of sales. So what can be deducted from all this? Trade terms were selected by ICC on two grounds: the repetition of a contractual practice and its duration, the duration of this repetition. So Incoterms find their roots in certain types of international sales contracts and repeated practices in those sales contracts. If I may, Thomas, I would like to warn our audience about a difficulty which can easily be avoided, but it's important to understand that not all sales contracts are concerned. The ICC did not study all sales contracts. The decision was to study the most commonly used sales contracts, which at the time were mostly land and maritime sales contracts because of the means of transport at the time. An additional difficulty for the ICC was that when trying to set up this innovative approach for the elaboration of the trade terms which led to Incoterms, the ICC had to face the fact that trade terms are highly related, highly dependent from a given location. The number of trade terms used, the frequency of their use, the meaning of the terms vary by countries, but also by places such as regions, city, ports in a country. I will give you a few examples. FOB Antwerp in Belgium is not the same as FOB Dunkirk in France, and not the same as FOB under the American Foreign Trade definitions of 1919. So you see that even the same term could have different meaning in various jurisdictions. As I said, the impact of time is also critical. The passing of time will have an influence on the meaning and the understanding and the practice related to the term. We may come to that later. So what kind of legal sources did ICC consider when elaborating the trade terms? Laws, but legislative instruments and case law were scarce at the time. As regard legislative instruments or acts, ICC, in its preliminary work on Incoterms, did not mention the existence of any international convention, except one uniform law on sales adopted by Scandinavian countries, that is to say Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, in 1905. So this law is extremely important because the way it is drafted has been used later by ICC to design a questionnaire that was sent out to traders to ask them about their contractual practices. And the model adopted by this, the format adopted by this uniform law of the Scandinavian countries was also used for the presentation, for the format used in the first version of the Incoterms rules in 1936. So this is really the ancestor, so to speak, of the Incoterms rules. The roots of the Incoterms rules could be found in this Scandinavian law on uniform law on sales of 1905. Legislative provisions existed in some countries, but there was no comprehensive law in any country about all the trade terms studied by ICC. So you had, for example, provisions regarding delivery in national laws, provisions regarding the transfer of risk, or provisions regarding packing obligations or insurance obligations, but you had no comprehensive set of definition of all trade terms. National laws did not distinguish domestic and international sales in some instances. So in some countries, there was no clear definition or no distinct regime for both types of sales. So once again, the approach followed by ICC had to face a number of practical impediments to ascertain which trade terms could be studied and how they should be studied. So a first step consisting in a comparative study of selected trade terms was retained as a first approach, as a preliminary step. And then only later on, ICC embarks on a promotional campaign to communicate the result of the study. To summarize, the oldest publication on trade terms, this publication is the result of these preliminary studies, the oldest that led to Incoterms. The oldest publication on trade terms, the ICC publication number 43, dates back 1923. So you see, it was really a priority for the organization. The decision to set up the organization was taken in 1919. The organization was created in 1920, and the trade terms publication with a capital T was released in 1923. It's a set of definitions. It's a compilation of trade terms approved by the ICC national committees, that is to say, by the local chapters of the organization in 13 countries. At the time, only 6 terms were studied, including FOB, FAs, free alongside ship, Franco-wagon, Franco-delivered, CIF, and C&F. Mm-hmm. What is interesting, and that's really the innovative approach, is that following this enumeration and this kind of standard definition or attempt to define in a standard manner the 6 terms, there was a second part in the publication, and this second part displays tables comparing the various definitions in the various countries in a standardized manner. So, for example, you had the meaning of, let's say, the term FOB in France, in Germany, in India, in the US, in England, and so on and so forth. This ICC publication number 43 was updated in 1929 in the brochure number 68, and the number of countries studied was expanded to 33. So from 13 in 1923 to 33 in 1929. In 1931, the brochure 68 was revised again, and the number of countries studied was brought to 35. So you can see it's a very thorough comparative law exercise that was launched by ICC. And another interesting aspect was that this brochure 68 was published in several languages. It was published in German first, and then in French, in English, and also in Swedish. So the publication of this document in various languages enabled a wide dissemination of the information around the globe. So that was also key in the success of that specific publication. There is also something amusing, but very important for the ICC, and especially in this respect, and that could explain the success of the Incoterms rules later on. Commercial practices, contractual practices were studied by countries. Countries were not selected on the basis of their political system or on the basis of their acceptance of free trade principles or the existence of the national committees in a country. It was completely open. The decision was to study the most important country for international trade. And that could explain why, for example, the USSR participated in the work. So, as I said, all these factors explain why these trade terms rules were so successful. Mm-hmm. And the success of the rules led ICC to believe that maybe one should consider going one step further. Maybe based on the charts, the comparative charts showing the respective interpretation in various countries, maybe we could come up to a common denominator, or maybe we could create one. And this is precisely what was achieved by the Incoterms rules in 1936.
Right. If you don't mind, Emmanuel, in the interest of time, because we are getting quite a few questions through the chat, and I would like to get to those as well. Is there something specific you would like to add when it comes to the drafting strategy and how the rules have come to be? Just so that we can maybe move on to the next question over the next maybe 2-3 minutes.
I would maybe answer with a joke. We should always be careful when involving lawyers in a drafting exercise, especially of a commercial contract. And that was exactly the approach followed by ICC. So in this respect as well, the approach was innovative. Right. The ICC expressly mentioned that it did not want lawyers at the time to reformulate or interpret commercial practices. So this explains why the Committee on Trade Terms launched a global survey to try to get raw material, raw information about contractual practices. And it's only at a later stage that lawyers were involved. But the compilation stage was mostly done by non-lawyers. And this could explain why people were not shy to explain how they were conducted trade. There was no reluctance to explain how they negotiated contracts, how they are loading, for example, the goods on a ship, even if that was not legally sound. That was what was done in practice. And this is why it was reported in this document.
Right. Okay. So you touched on the legal aspects of the Incoterms, and I think that's a logical transition to the other questions I had. One that's been coming through and that we had planned for is 80 years on. So, we touched a little bit about the roots, the inception of these rules. But what is the legal status of the Incoterms rules today?
Well, I think that if I answer that, I'm not sure you won't be very satisfied. But to be fully honest, I have to say that it's a hotly debated question, mostly among among scholars, because in practice, very often traders do not really care. Although this could have some legal implications, but the question is that Incoterms today, the Incoterms rules are used in countless transactions every day. They are used in many documents. They are, of course, used in model contracts, but they are also, for example, reported on customs forms, customs declarations, statistical declarations, for example, in the EU. These Incoterms rules have also been endorsed, or their use has been recommended by international bodies, such as the UN Commission for International Trade Law, the UN Economic Commission for Europe. They are also used in many professional standard forms of contract. They are widely used. And one might wonder whether this very broad use does not give them a very specific status. For example, could we consider the Incoterms rules as trade usages or customs, or are they simply rules of interpretation with no legal consequences attached to them? or are they contractual provisions? If this is the case, what kind of contractual provisions? I have a personal view, which is not widely shared, but allow me, or pardon me, to believe that it's the right one, if I may say so. Because I think it's the one which is the most respectful of the work of the ICC and which takes into account the new elements introduced by Incoterms over time.
Right.
No one will challenge the fact that Incoterms rules are based on pre-existing rules to a certain extent. I mentioned the Scandinavian law, Uniform Law on Sales of 1905. I mentioned old trade terms like FOB, CIF in the old English common law. And these FOB and CIF terms certainly had the legal status of trade usages. But one would also not challenge the fact that the ICC did not limit itself in its innovative approach that we touched upon a few minutes ago. The ICC did not limit itself to simply or merely compiling existing rules. The ICC introduced new elements. Incoterms were revised over time to take into consideration new techniques, legal techniques, but also transport techniques, logistics, and new technologies, new practices, for example, in the banking sector, in the finance sector. So there are new elements, and one should not minimize these new elements. If you take, for example, the free on board airport term that was introduced by the ICC in 1976, I have difficulty to consider that this term is a trade usage. It was created by the ICC. Maybe it was used in some contract by some traders, but the use of this term was clearly not generalized. It was not widespread. So you could not say all Incoterms rules are based on pre-existing practices. And that's why my interpretation of the legal status of the rule is that if there is a trade usage, the trade usage is not the rule, because the rules contain new elements, but the trade usage is to make reference to the rules. The trade usage is to incorporate an Incoterms into your international contracts. And this is a very important element in legal terms, because it means that if one mentions a trade terms in a contract, but mentions it in a way which is not fully in accordance with the recommendation of the ICC, which is to say that the term was not properly explicitly incorporated. Let's say, for example, a party mentions CIF in a contract without mentioning that it's an Incoterms rules. If this CIF term has the status of an international trade usage, a judge or an arbitrator will tend to interpret this term, this trade term, as an Incoterms rules rather than as a mere trade term. So legal consequences attached to the status of the rules is extremely important. But as I said, it seems to be a more theoretical question because it does not give rise to difficulties in practice.
Right. So I am mindful of time, and we have some listener questions that are coming in now. But one thing I wanted to end on is, as we begin to wrap up, did you have any closing thoughts? And by that, I mean, do you have something that is the number one thing that you want people to take away from the conversation as it relates to the origin of the Incoterms?
Yes. I would say that Incoterms are really part of the landscape of international trade. So, as I said, well, whether there are trade usages or not is, in a sense, not really important. But most of the time, you would be expected to know something about Incoterms. knowing how they have been elaborated and why they have evolved over time. There are many versions of Incoterms, not so many, but a number of versions of Incoterms, and each of these versions, each of the revisions leading to a new version of Incoterms was prompted by changes, as we mentioned, in technology, new practices. So it's important to understand why we change the rules from time to time. It's also important to understand that in the recent year, since 1980, the revision was done every 10 years, but it is not something written in stone. It's not something which is provided for in the rules. It's a practice because we think that given the pace of international trade, it's normal and it's expected from the ICC to update one of these most successful rules every 10 years. I would conclude by saying that if you remember what Incoterms rules are, if you remember that they have been elaborated by ICC and only by ICC, there is only one set of Incoterms rules. That Incoterms rules are not exclusively an acronym or an expression, but a set of obligations grouped by articles, rubrics in the various terms. So it's not simply FOB or CIF. It's much more than that. You will avoid a great number. I won't give you a figure, but I'm ready to say that you would probably avoid more than 90 or 95% of the difficulties that arise in practice regarding the use of Incoterms. And my very, very last comment would be that Incoterms have been extremely successful in securing international trade. So don't think that you're better off drafting your own trade terms. You're better off redrafting the Incoterms yourselves. Use the existing terms. That's the beauty of a uniform rules. Everyone is supposed to understand it. Drafter, negotiators, judges, in case of a dispute, arbitrators. So use the existing terms, refer to the ICC publication, and of course, listen to the next presentation on the Incoterms 2020 rules.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So I know we're going to be shooting a little bit from the hip here because these questions are coming in hot. But let's try and do a sort of rapid fire and, maybe for 1 minute, your instinctual answer, let's say, to a few of these. So first of all, the ones that I can answer myself is that this session was not intended to cover the 2020 rules. So as Emmanuel rightly said, we have recorded a special episode specifically for the 2020 rules that will be going up on our website shortly after this one. And for those who came in late to this session, this recording will also be available to everyone on our YouTube and our website in 1 week's time. So just a little bit of patience for those who missed the first half. If you came in late, no worries. We'll make that available for free on our YouTube. And then 1 week after that, we will be having one with another member of ICC who will be covering the 2020 rules. So that that's a little bit of housekeeping right off the top. So let me go down the list here. Okay, so we have one from Nicola saying, how important is it that each entity pays his relevant Incoterms freight cost? We want to simplify our freight forwarding invoicing, and we have paid and all have paid by one entity. So I think he's talking specifically about when it comes to the freight costs. I don't know if that's something that you are in the right person to answer, otherwise we can forward that to the ICC teams.
I would say that it's better to send it to the ICC team. Why?
Right.
Because if you look at the history of Incoterms, which is the topic of today, the rules have changed over time.
Yes.
Of course, the Incoterms allocate freight costs, transport costs, but the way it was done and the degree of precision with which it was done has changed over time with the various versions of Incoterms. Of course, the recent version of Incoterms are much more precise in this respect, but there are many practical elements that should be taken into consideration to answer the question precisely, and I don't think that we have time to do it now.
No worries, no worries. So we had a few people wondering, including Veronique and Usha, who were wondering about the relationship between ICC and the WTO when it comes to the Incoterms specifically.
Well, there is no, to the best of my knowledge, when looking at the archives, there is no link between ICC and WTO regarding Incoterms specifically. But of course, there are many relationships and ongoing discussion between ICC and WTO regarding a number of other topics, which are, by the way, explained and set out more clearly on the ICC website and on various ICC platforms. So if you're interested on the topic, I think you should look at the ICC website and what is done for international trade topics.
Right, that makes sense. One other one we had was from someone called Angus, who has asked, has ICC identified commonly incorrect usages of Incoterms? What are the most common mistakes, and would Incoterms 2020 fix them? So the later half of that question when it comes to 2020 we'll skip for now, but the first half when it comes to has ICC identified commonly incorrect usage of Incoterms, throughout the legacy and lifetime of the Incoterms, maybe you have an example that you could share with us.
Yes, I have to say that I have plenty of those pathological use of the terms. We could devote almost a full session on these mistakes. I will mention a few. For example, the incorrect interpretation of an acronym. The one that I liked the most was FAS, standing, as we all know, for free alongside ship. So the S in the acronym stands for ship, but someone interpreted it as free alongside and mentioned the terms in a road transport contract with the transport of the goodbye truck. So free alongside truck instead of ship. Of course, the truck does not have a ship's rail. So when the passing of risk is supposed to occur at the passing of the ship's rail, you have a problem if you ship the good on a truck. Another difficulty was, or still is, when parties used an old version of the rules. Let's assume that they conclude a contract now, and instead of using Incoterms 2010, they will use, let's say something stupid, Incoterms 1936. What was the intent of the party? In case of a dispute, did they intend to exclude all modifications and adaptation of the terms? Did they intend to really use the terms existing at the time? But of course, legislation, commercial practice has changed, and transport had changed a lot since 1936. So always use the correct, the effective version of the rules and not previous ones, if possible. Another difficulty is that parties are sometimes relying on what I would call, the caption. In the new version of the rules, you have a short introductory paragraph at the beginning of the terms, after the acronym, after the expression, the Incoterms rules expression, like free on board, set in full letters, you have an explanation. And some parties think that the Incoterms rules is only that part, and do not read all the obligations which are set out explicitly later in the publication. So be aware that Incoterms rules are not limited to an acronym or to an expression. And I will finish by the most common mistake, which is to mix up various contractual relationships. As I said, trade terms and then Incoterms are terms which are used in international sales contract. They can also be used in domestic sales, and this is something that has been said repeatedly by the ICC since 1990, and especially in the Incoterms 2000, or during the Incoterms 2000 revision. But you should not use Incoterms, for example, in your transport contract for transport, or in your insurance contract, or at least Incoterms will not regulate that contract. Incoterms only regulate transactions between a seller and a buyer. They could be cross-references or use of an Incoterms for information purposes in other contracts, like an insurance contract, like a contract for the financing of the sale, transport contract, but Incoterms would not regulate those contracts.
Okay, so I have one final question. Sorry, I'm getting the audio a little bit delayed, so there might be a small pause there. So you touched a little bit on one of them from Javier that says, "Can I use Incoterms from a previous version, for example, the 2000 version, if I specify the version?"
As a matter of contract, you can always do it. You can even use the Incoterms 1936. Now, the practical consequences attached to that choice would probably lead you to believe that it's not worth doing it.
Right.
What I would rather recommend is to use the effective version, the version in force of the Incoterms rules, and to a very limited extent, to adapt the rules in case of absolute need. So let's assume that you're using the Incoterms, you want to enter into a contract now, today. The Incoterms version applicable in Incoterms 2010, but you don't like a specific provision of Incoterms rules 2010. You can, of course, by way of contract, you can adapt this Incoterms rules provision. But if you do so, and this is a common mistake, if you do so, you should ensure that the modification you introduce in the rules would not make it inconsistent, would not create difficulties with the other provisions of the contract. So the answer is yes, it's possible to refer to previous version of the rules. I would not recommend it. Rather use the existing version, adapt it if and only if necessary, and to a very limited extent.
Okay, very good. So apologies for those whose questions we weren't able to get to here. So I will be leaving the chat open so that hopefully either anyone from ICC or from ICC Academy, or even those who are within the chat themselves, I imagine there's a few practitioners in there, would be able to help each other with answering a few of those questions. If not, feel free to reach out to the ICC Academy, and then we will forward those questions over to the relevant people. So I wanted to thank, first of all, thank you, Emmanuel, so much for your time today. This has been incredibly interesting, and I think everyone agrees that they at least learned something new about the history of Incoterms. It's a fascinating topic, and I really want to thank you for making the time. I know we ran a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but I think it was definitely worth it.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you all for listening to me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And for everyone interested in learning more about the Incoterms rules, again, we encourage you to visit the ICC Academy website. Our new certificate is the only officially licensed ICC online course on the upcoming 2020 rules, and comes packed with study documents, animated videos, and industry case studies. You'll also learn to improve your business transactions by finding the right Incoterms rule thanks to our exclusive comparison matrix. So please check out our website. There's a much more comprehensive overview of the course, and our teams are standing by to answer any questions in the chat. So as a reminder, we are hosting these live broadcasts every month, so sign up on our website for free if you haven't already, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of the ICC Livecast. See you next time.